Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Zsuzsa Csergo, political studies professor here at Queen's, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this wonderful teaching event that was proposed by Dr. Sandra Den Otter, Vice Provost of International Affairs here at Queen's, and I'd like to thank her for initiating it and helping to organize it. And Dr. Vassili Schedrin, who is a historian here at Queen's, historian of Jewish Russian history, and he is the coordinator of the Russian and East European Studies Network. And he has done a lot to bring a variety of perspectives together. I'm very thankful, and he is going to moderate the conversation. And I would also like to thank all our presenters for being here. I'm not going to spend time on introducing everyone because Dr. Schedrin will do that. I'm just going to give him the floor. I do want to thank the Center for the Study of Democracy and Diversity for co-sponsoring it, and Dr. Margaret Moore, who is the director of the center. And so I am going to give the floor to Dr. Schedrin. One thing I forgot to mention, though, that the real hosts of this event are you, the students of Political Studies course 332, which is titled Politics of Post-Communism. So thank you for hosting this and being here.
Good morning to everyone, and let us start. We're here to talk about the war in Ukraine, and I would say we're here to talk about the thing that was unthinkable not so long ago. So the main goal of today's teaching event is to give you a food for thought, the vital information to understand what was going on. I'm very grateful to the panel of distinguished experts who agreed to participate in the panel and share their knowledge and expertise with you. And I will introduce them now in the order of their speaking. Dr. Olga Andriewsky, Associate Professor in the Department of History at Trent University. And her focus is the history of Ukraine within the Russian Empire and USSR and in the post-Soviet period. Dr. Rebecca Manley, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of History at Queen's University. And she's working in the field of history of Russia and the Soviet Union. Dr. Taras Koznarsky, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at University of Toronto. And Professor Koznarsky works in the fields of Ukrainian and Russian literatures, national and cultural identities. Dr. Olga Talal, Research Fellow in Political Studies at Queen's University. And her focus is nationalism and ethnicity, minority rights, and public policy towards minorities. Dr. Zsuzsa Csergo, Professor of Comparative Politics and International Relations in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. And Professor Csergo is doing work in the areas such as nationalism, the politics of ethnicity and democratization, Central and Eastern European politics, European integration, and the politics of language use. Dr. Thomas Hughes, a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for International and Defense Policy at Queen's University. And Dr. Hughes is doing the work in the fields of confidence building, arms control, deterrence, and strategic culture. And finally, we have an honor to have Dr. David Pedlar, the Scientific Director of the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research at Queen's University. And Dr. Pedlar is working in many fields, including the mental health impact of the war, disaster mental health practice, and veterans affairs. So I am grateful and I welcome our experts. A few words about the technical organization of our meeting. They start with the expert presentations, who will speak around 5 minutes each. In the meantime, I suggest that you think about the questions that you will be able to ask after the end of the presentations. In terms of technology, if you're participating online and asking question, consider two options. You can write your question in the chat. I will monitor it. And you can also do it in live manner using your Zoom. Those who are want to speak from the audience, just raise their hand and I'll come with the microphone to you, so your voice will be heard and recorded for history. Okay. So we are starting, and I am giving the floor to our first presenter, Professor Olga Andriewsky. Olga, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this very timely event. Ukrainian history, both in Russia as well as in the West, has for a very long time been viewed through the lens of Russian history. And this morning in my 5 minutes, I hope I can stick to 5 minutes, I want to debunk 3 myths about Ukraine and Ukrainian history. But since I only have 5 minutes, I'd like to begin by recommending 2 books on Ukrainian history for further reading, Serhiy Yakelchik's Ukraine, A Modern History, and Serhiy Plokhey's The Gates of Europe. Both are excellent books, and both will give readers a full sense of the long and complex history of Ukraine. Well, the first myth about Ukraine that I'd like to debunk is that these are ancestral Russian lands. If you listen to Russian news or read Putin's speeches, you get the sense that Russia has a special historical claim to Ukraine, that these are Russian ancestral lands. Even ordinary Russians often talk about our Ukraine. The myth of Ukraine as historic Russian territory was in fact vigorously promoted by Catherine the Great in the late 18th century as part of an attempt to legitimize Russia's expansionist policies, and particularly the partitions of Poland, that is the division of Poland in the late 18th century of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth between Prussia and Austria and Russia. Kiev had, since 6 centuries earlier, been the center of the first major state on this territory, Kievan Rus, a dynasty originally established by the Vikings, and at its height in the 11th century had stretched all the way to the Gulf of Finland in the north. This ancient history was used many, many centuries later to justify the annexation of Polish territory, and ultimately the annexation of Western Ukraine, Galicia, Eastern Galicia, during the First World War. In the 19th century and leading up to the First World War, these were referred to as the lost lands of Rus that were to be reunited. What this myth did, among other things, is to erase, sorry, I'm trying to switch the slide here, is to erase 6 centuries of history, to erase the histories of all the various peoples who lived in Ukraine, Jews and Poles, and even Ukrainians themselves, to erase this multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious complexity of Ukraine. And in particular, it disregarded the very existence of the Kazakh social order and the Kazakh state that had merged in Ukraine in subsequent centuries. Even after Eastern Ukraine became a protectorate of Russia, this Kazakh order survived, and it in fact survived until 1917 as a distinct set of social structures and social institutions and social practices that then came to be defined as Ukrainian. Which brings me to the second myth about Ukraine. The idea that this is not only a Russian land, but that Ukrainians, or Little Russians as they were called before 1917, were part of one indivisible all-Russian nation. This myth, I'm convinced, has now been shattered once and for all, but it is remarkable how long this fantasy persisted. It too became dominant in the 19th century, influenced not only by a new romantic understanding of the nation as a cultural, linguistic, and ethnic unity, but shaped also to a very large extent by a century-long and extraordinarily challenging struggle for control of one of the most culturally and ethnically heterogeneous areas of what became the Russian Empire. And increasingly in the 19th century, it was this myth of the Russianness of the Russian Empire, rather than purely dynastic concepts of political legitimacy that many Russian intellectuals and officials came to regard as the essential bond of stability and order. So the idea of one all-Russian nation became, in effect, state policy in 1863, when Ukrainians proposed a language edition of the Bible. The Russian Minister of Internal Affairs famously declared that there has never been, does not exist, and cannot exist a distinct Ukrainian language and culture, and introduced the first of a whole series of prohibitions against the Ukrainian language and the Ukrainian movement. Well, in effect, what the imperial government did was to stake its own future on this myth of a single indissoluble Russian nation, a gamble that proved to be utterly implausible in 1917, 1918, when during the revolution, Ukrainians asserted their political independence. Which brings me to my third and final myth, that Ukraine, as Putin recently said, was created by Lenin, that it was a Soviet invention. The creation of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1922 was not Lenin's invention. On the contrary, it was an admission by Lenin and the Communist Party that they lacked the political and military strength to subdue Ukraine. The Bolshevik Party was an urban Russian working class party, but they had very little support in Ukraine during the revolution, with one exception, and that was the coal mining region of the Donbass. Jewish workers tended to support the Mensheviks, not the Bolsheviks. They preferred the Mensheviks because, unlike the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks recognized the autonomy of local organizations. And ethnic Ukrainians, who represented 80% of the population, were predominantly rural and farmers and tended to support Ukrainian political parties. They fought violently against the Bolsheviks, especially against the policies of grain requisitioning during the Civil War. So the Ukrainian Republic was, in fact, a concession, an acknowledgement that the party lacked the strength to tame the countryside, that the village remained largely beyond the control of the Bolsheviks. And Lenin himself acknowledged this when he said the Bolsheviks are, quote, a handful of conquerors in an occupied country. The real showdown came in 1932-33, when the rural population that had resisted Bolshevik rule and then resisted collectivization was finally subdued through artificial famine, that is, during the Holodomor, which killed an estimated 3 to 4 million people in Ukraine. I want to make one last point. It's not a coincidence that so many of the myths that have guided Putin's thinking about Ukraine and Russia's historical mission are rooted in the 19th century, that is in the late imperial period. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia and Ukraine went in very different directions. As censorship lifted, as it became possible to republish and read books from the pre-Soviet era, Russians discovered their imperial history. And I remember being surprised, absolutely astonished by the sheer volume of extreme Russian nationalist literature from the pre-revolutionary era that was being republished in Russia in the 1990s. Really nasty, anti-Semitic, Ukrainophobic stuff. Ukrainians, by contrast, rediscovered a very different history. A long-standing anti-colonial movement, a distinct history, including a centuries-long struggle for sovereignty and independence. And I think it helps explain, at least in part, how we have arrived at this moment and why Putin and the men who planned this war were not just going to Ukraine to hunt for Nazis, but also went there expecting Russian troops to be greeted as liberators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olga. And our next presenter is Rebecca Manley. Please, Rebecca.
Thank you for including me in this event. I'm a historian of the Soviet Union and particularly of the Second World War. And as a scholar of the Second World War, the images and stories that have emanated from Ukraine over the past month have been particularly and eerily disturbing and familiar. We've seen images of cities being bombed. We've seen crowds of evacuees at railway stations waiting, hoping to get on a train that would take them to safety. We've seen food supplies dwindle, and most recently, with cities under siege, we've seen starvation. The specter of the Second World War haunts the current crisis in many ways. And in my remarks today, I'd like to focus on the memory wars that have shaped in many ways Putin's presentation of this invasion, and that help us make sense in some capacity of what is going on. Putin's invocation of the Second World War to justify his invasion of Ukraine is well known, I think, to all of you. He framed Russia's aims in terms of the, quote, denazification of Ukraine. And he has very absurdly and patently falsely cast the government in Kiev as openly neo-Nazi Banderovite Nazis. Now, Putin's invocation of the war, his deliberate framing of the invasion of Ukraine within this larger picture of the Second World War draws on a very well-established myth, the myth of the Second World War. And this was a myth that was promoted in the Soviet Union following the war, that became the central legitimizing myth of Soviet power, and that was badly tarnished in the 1990s, both domestically and abroad. And Putin, since his inauguration in 2000, has sought to resuscitate this myth, both in commemorative practices and in a law, a memory law that prohibits the so-called falsification of activities of the Soviet Union during the war. Putin has deployed these memory wars against critics domestically. He's also deployed them very pointedly on a geopolitical stage, and particularly in an attempt to reassert Russia's preeminent role in Eastern Europe. These memory wars and this deployment has been particularly focused when it comes to Ukraine. And since, in particular, since Russia's first incursion, illegal incursion into Ukraine in 2014, the seizure of Crimea, and the fomentation of war in the Donbass, Putin has sought, and actually even before that with the Euromaidan protests of 2013, Putin has sought to brand any political movements in Ukraine that have challenged the close relationship with Russia with the mark of fascism and Nazism. Now, why does he think this is going to play what is the status of the memory of the war in Ukraine? Ukraine occupies an important, if ambivalent, place in these memory wars. Ukraine suffered tremendously heavy losses during the Second World War. As many as 8 million residents of the Ukrainian Republic died. Following Ukrainian independence in 1991, the history of World War II emerged as a contested space. One historian referred to by our previous speaker, Serhiy Plokhy, referred to it as a battleground of two different versions of the country's past. These different versions of the past were grounded in two different historical experiences and historical realities. Whereas the populations of the East and the South had fought within the ranks of the Red Army, some 3 million men had done so, and as Soviet partisans during the war, the populations of the territories in the West, most notably Galicia, which had never been part of the Russian Empire and had been forcibly incorporated by the Red Army into the Soviet Union. In those territories, there were many people who supported Ukrainian nationalist organizations who were actively fighting against the Soviet state during the war as part of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or the OUN, one branch of which was led by integral nationalist Stepan Bandera, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA. Now, that's a very short historical background, but in the 2000s, these different histories became, as Plokhy suggested, that means I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap up, became a battleground. Successive Ukrainian presidents decided, or sort of sought to resuscitate, in their search for a usable past, an anti-Soviet usable past, sought to resuscitate the history of these nationalists. Even promoting Bandera to the position of a sort of hero of the country. These were very contested moves, sharply criticized by many historians within Ukraine, by a liberal elite, and viewed with a high degree of unpopularity in the East. And Putin, in his presentation of the war as a war against Nazism, was appealing not only to a Russian public, who he was attempting to convince that this was, to justify the war, but also he assumed that this would fall on receptive ears in Eastern Ukraine. His assumptions were clearly misguided. While the history of the war, Second World War, does remain fraught in Ukraine, and here I'm stepping out of my role as a historian and saying something a little bit more about the present, it strikes me as I've watched what has unfolded in Ukraine over the past month, that what we have seen, instead of a prolongation of these memory wars, Zelensky has shown us, and ordinary Ukrainian citizens have shown us, that they have an ability to hold competing versions of the past together, that there's a vision of what it means to be Ukrainian that is grounded not simply in a singular version of the past, but in a shared civic present, a present that is democratic, and in that respect represents a particular threat to Putin's authoritarian Russia. My final thought to leave you with, and this is that Putin has not only misunderstood Ukraine, but he has grossly miscalculated. By brutally invading the country, armaments and bombs have furnished very brutally and very tragically the Ukrainian population with what will undoubtedly become a new common shared past with very little contestation.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And our next speaker is Taras Koznarsky. Taras, please.
I think I'll share my screen, if I may. Can I share my screen?
You can.
Okay. How do I do that?
Oh, you just press share screen button. You should have it enabled.
Okay, perfect. Okay, here we go.
Okay, great.
All right. So my focus here is going to be Ukrainian language. I apologize if I cough too much, but it was a strange little cold that developed. But anyhow, so I'll start and connect with Olga Andriewsky's presentation on Russian myths, Russian history. Ukrainian literary language emerged in the modern Ukrainian literary language emerged in the very late 18th century with the publication of Ivan Kotlяревsky's travesty of Virgil's Aeneid into vernacular, as we call it. And that began the new era of Ukrainian language, Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian culture. If we ask, was there something, what was there before? And the answer would be, as with many early modern polities societies, there was a society that operated in a plurilingual environment within Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Ukrainian elites, literary elites, used Church Slavonic, Latin, Polish, and bookish Ukrainian. Throughout 18th century, with the dissolution of the Ukrainian Cossack autonomy, Russian was introduced forcibly, and the book publication was suppressed and controlled in the local variants of language in Ukraine, in the Hetmanate. And with the dissolution of the administration, Ukrainian autonomous administration, these languages began to shift, and Russian replaced most of them. And the bookish Ukrainian therefore became obsolete. But on the other hand, the discovery of the vernacular language, that is living language of peasants, of spoken language in towns, in cities, became the basis for the creation of literary Ukrainian. Starting with Kotlяревsky, with this first book in literary Ukrainian in 1798, further explorations were made in 1810s, 1820s, and there was an reactivation of these activities in the 1820s and 30s during the Romantic period, where various members of Ukrainian intelligentsia, elites, tried to express and succeeded expressing various and formulating various genres, poetic and prosaic, in Ukrainian language. And under the umbrella of Romanticism within the Russian Empire, within 1830s, 1820s, that was still an enviable enterprise, because Russian elites, Russian intellectuals still tried to shape what Russian culture, Russian language could be at that point. The nationalization of Russian Empire occurred later, when the language of the empire and the language of the people was pronounced to be and announced to be Russian. So these earlier experiments, what they proved to us, that there are a couple of interesting sort of ways of discussions that took place at that time. So what is Ukrainian language? Is it a language or is it a dialect? And that question is always strategic, because it connects with how a particular intellectual positions this language, whether he's trying to, mostly men, he's trying to underscore Ukrainian as the most pure Slavic language, and there's a trend like that. Ukrainian preserved elements of old Slavic, old Slavic Rus language that contemporary or modern Russian lost. So the purity. On the other end of this axis is the opposite. Is it pure? Is it as close to this original language as possible, or is it as far? Is it contaminated with the Polish, with the German, with the foreign words? So the discussion of dialectness or languageness of Ukrainian are always lead to these positioning. Is it, are you trying to endorse the value of Ukrainian language by approximating it with the Russian, or are you trying to do it by distinguishing it from Russian? And these discussions took place in the 20s, in the 30s. The first grammar of Ukrainian language occurred was published in 1818, but already then we see pressures that publications in Ukrainian should be pushed to the background of what mainstream Russian publications are and should be, and suppression of literary institutions and literary publications occur rather early. One of the most striking reactions to the development of Ukrainian literature and literature published in Ukrainian literary language or vernacular occur with the emergence of Taras Shevchenko, the first sort of great romantic bard, and reactions to his poetry included almost offended attitude that how could you be a great poet and write in Ukrainian? Because mainstream or great poetry should be written in the imperial language. So that's one movement within Ukrainian cultural and linguistic tradition. The other movement that we have to keep in mind that most writers, most intellectuals and activists in Ukraine were bilingual, and they were also producing works in Russian language. And these works, on the one hand, they entered the literary market, literary scene in the Russian Empire. But on the other hand, they also created the phenomenon of minor literature, that is literature written in Russian, but literature that operates on the levels that appeal both to the general imperial public, but have a particular message, sometimes quite subversive to the local elites and local Ukrainian readers. And examples of such literature, of course, includes Gogol, it includes Historia Rusov. So we have also, we need to keep this in mind, that Ukrainian culture and literature developed in the bilingual environment that progressed through the 19th century, where Ukrainian took over larger and larger sections of cultural production. The repressions of Ukrainian language in Valuyev circular of, and let me move to this one, of 1863, and later through M's decree by Alexander II, primarily targeted the development of Ukrainian as a language of instruction among rural masses, the publications of books for schools became quite alarming. The publication of translations, literary translations into Ukrainian was always subversive in this context because it meant that it's a language. You don't translate into a dialect. When you translate Pushkin, Mickiewicz, Goethe, if you translate into Ukrainian, that means you're establishing a literary language on par with the universal cultural map of the time. And these were always dangerous, suspicious, and they were, of course, prohibited in these measures. These measures, of course, should be viewed in general context of Russification in the Russian Empire during Alexander II that took place in the frontiers of the Russian Empire in the Baltic and in Ukraine as well. However, these measures, while they did slow down and suppressed the activities within the Russian Empire, Ukrainian activities, on the other hand, they stimulated a lively exchange, cultural, literary exchange between the Galician Ukrainian lands, which were part of the Habsburg Empire, and the central Ukrainian lands, part of the Russian Empire. So whatever was not possible to publish in Kiev or Kharkiv became possible to publish in Lviv, and therefore unwillingly Russian restrictive measures created ways of overcoming them by connecting between the intellectuals and writers in two different lands of Ukraine that belong to two different empires. Now, in 1897, what is interesting is that Ukrainian provinces were, of course, predominantly Ukrainian, but the Ukrainian population, Ukrainian-speaking population, or Ukrainian ethnic population lived primarily in the villages. 80% of inhabitants in Ukraine declared Ukrainian their language, but only a third of Ukrainians lived in the cities and towns. And the larger the city, the smaller the percentage of Ukrainians. So there was always that tension between the rural area and the cities in Ukraine. This map shows the distribution of Ukrainian language according to the census of 1897. So when the revolution struck, the revolution of 1905 alleviated some of these restrictive measures, but they were reintroduced in 1914 with the start of World War I. But as the February revolution struck in 1917, then it gave avenue for Ukrainian masses, rural masses, Ukrainian elites, Ukrainian soldiers returning from the front to mobilize and established their administration, their Ukrainian Central Rada or statehood. And it was accompanied by sort of initiative to transition from Russian language and establish Ukrainian as a full-fledged state language. The reaction to this, and this is what I think is quite interesting, the reaction to these initiatives, the reaction to these changes, to me, they're best expressed in Mikhail Bulgakov's famous novel, White Guard, where the protagonist, Alexei Turbin, expresses his frustration and his anger at these initiatives. And what I find most illustrative is that it's not the military affairs or not even political affairs. It is the shift in language environment that elicits the most strong outburst from the monarchist, old-time Russophone intelligentsia, such as Alexei Turbin, who terrorized the Russian population with this awful language, which doesn't even exist. So again, he repeats the Valuev's formula, the damnable language. In other words, he treats language as a weapon that destroys the tradition of monarchist, of Russian, Ruski Mir, of Russian as the umbrella under which Ukrainian Russians, Belarusians should exist within the same homogeneous space. Again, I'm not going to focus, but if you look at the chart, at the table here, you will see how development of Kiev from 1874, the growth of population until 1926, illustrates the shifts in demography. With the modernization of the Russian Empire, the cities become more Russian, but with the revolution and in the 1920s, the Bolsheviks initiate a new policy called Korenizatsiya, which in Ukrainian lands is called Ukrainianization. On the one hand, it is a concession to Ukrainian socialists, elites, administrative elites, that Bolsheviks try to co-opt and assure them that they should be part of the new Soviet hierarchy. On the other hand, it also reflected the remarkable mobilization, the movement of rural dwellers into the cities, and therefore this short-lived period of Ukrainianization, official Ukrainianizations in the mid-1920s to the end of the early 1830s, provided yet another opportunity to for Ukrainian culture and language to develop in a full-fledged ways that is becoming a language of education, of administration, and the language of remarkable array of literary works. Needless to say, in the 1930s, these policies came to an abrupt end when Stalin both stopped this policy and with Stalinist terror, most of these activists, both communist leaders such as Shumsky and Ukrainian writers were executed, exiled, executed during the purges. Now I'll fast forward to contemporary events and contemporary situations. So this map shows how toward the end of the Soviet Union, the distribution of Ukrainian language in 1989 versus 2001 shifts throughout Ukraine. After the war, further measures for Russification were taken, and there were all kinds of restrictions imposed on Ukrainian within Ukraine. I would, if I have a couple of minutes from my own experience, I studied at Lviv University, and when I studied Slavic philology, with my first field was Czech. At that point, the only second field that I could take in the philological department was Russian. But when I returned from the army, the situation changed. So I could continue with Czech, but I could also take Ukrainian. But one thing that struck me, when I look, and all the courses were required. So you go to the hall near the dean's office and you look at your schedule. And there I was looking at what courses I'm going to take. And one of these courses was puzzling, because the course was called Neridna mova, that means non-native language. And when I saw this title of a course, what is it? It turns out it was Ukrainian. So why for a Lviv University, and my first language is Ukrainian, why at that university in philological department, Ukrainian is defined as non-native language? And I didn't think much about it, but later when I started studying the colonial aspects of Ukrainian-Russian interactions, I realized that this is the way a Soviet system would work in Lviv or Almaty. Because for a student...
Taras, I'm sorry for interruption, so we're running out of time, so if you could wrap up.
So the only other footnote I'll make, that over the past years, there were all kinds of political fights and debates about Ukrainian. Ukrainian was weaponized again. And when Putin and his regime says that there is a genocide of Russians, there is a suppression of Russian language, it's yet another myth and strategy, obviously false. Because when we look at the laws about language and attempts to shift and change it, what does it mean, the law of Ukrainian language as a state language? Does it suppress Russian speakers? Does it prevent them from using their language? Ukrainian is a multilingual country. And the only reason why Russian Putinist ideologues attack the establishment of Ukrainian as a state language is that it is required to know Ukrainian. That is, there is bilingualism and multilingualism, but this is a language that everyone needs to learn. The alternative for these ideologues is the situation where Ukrainian is not required to be for everyone to learn and to know. And so this is, instead of bilingualism, it's the proposal or push for a linguistic environment in Ukraine where knowing of the state language is not necessary. I'll stop here. Again, and stop sharing. Thank you.
I'll take care of it. Thank you very much, Taras. Our next speaker is Olga Talal. Olga, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for putting together this interdisciplinary panel. It's fascinating. I think my talk will connect quite well to the previous talkers, but I will move to contemporary history of Ukraine as I'm a political scientist. So I just want to briefly highlight 3 events we are all familiar with and to see their relevance for the ongoing war. And these are, of course, the referendum in 1991 in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, and the Euromaidan and the Revolution of Dignity protests. So in 1991, Ukraine withdrew from the USSR. And later in December that year, it held a referendum on independence in which 92% of Ukrainians voted in favor of Ukrainian independence. And that includes eastern regions. Even though support there was somewhat lower than in Western Ukraine, it still stood at 82–83%, which is very high. I think this referendum is important not only for the overwhelming support of Ukrainians for Ukrainian independence, but also for a couple more things. So first, and this connects to the first talk, the recurrent issues throughout the past century of Ukrainians seeking independence from Russian rule in its various forms, at the same time as Russia continued and continues to deny it, and presently the President Putin insists that Russians and Ukrainians are brotherly nations, or perhaps even the same nation, and questions the very foundation of Ukrainian sovereignty. The referendum, I think, is also illuminating something about the ongoing negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to end the war. And that is that it has been the position of Ukraine that it does not recognize any territorial changes since they were established in 1991. And territorial changes, its official keeps saying, would include in officially recognizing the annexation of Crimea and some sort of independent or autonomous status to the Donetsk and Luhansk republics would only be possible via a new national referendum, which they, of course, have good reasons to believe would not support it. Now, the second event is the Orange Revolution that took place in 2004, and as it was prompted by electoral fraud or perception of broad electoral fraud and disputed results of presidential elections. It results in favor of pro-Russian presidential candidate of Viktor Yanukovych, but under popular pressure, immense pressure of the protests, in the runoff of the presidential elections, Viktor Yushchenko wins the election and becomes Ukraine's president, officially ending the Orange Revolution. Now, we of course all know about the way Putin feels about color revolutions, as they present an immediate threat to the legitimacy of his own rule at home, and particularly when color revolutions occur on the borderlands of Russia. And he has repeatedly expressed his view of the need to suppress color revolutions wherever they occur. Last event that I want to comment on is the Euromaidan, and especially the Revolution of Dignity, when Ukrainians take to the streets again. It's another formative event in the contemporary history of Ukrainians and the shaping of them as a political nation. So they break out and lead to the overthrow of Yanukovych that I've mentioned before. The pro-Russian president also flees to Russia, where he stays. At the same time, protests against Kiev and the Revolution of Dignity break out in eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, where he had enjoyed widespread support. And I just want to finish by talking about the ramifications of these, especially of a Revolution of Dignity to this day and the aftermath of that revolution. So first, Russia, of course, immediately moved to annex Crimea, and then it backed the separatists in the eastern Ukraine. And that conflict has been going on for 8 years with lots of casualties and without any significant changes to the front lines of the two countries. The second ramification is that as a result of this revolution, Ukraine actually sets a clear course toward seeking to join the EU and NATO membership. And that has been supported by the then President Petro Poroshenko and since 2019 by Zelensky. And in fact, in that presidential campaign of 2019, the two leading candidates, Zelensky and Poroshenko, did not differ on this position at all. And they enjoyed reflecting the public mood in Ukraine and the support of the majority of Ukrainians to take the course of foreign policy toward the West, quote unquote, and seek joining EU and later on NATO as well. And here again, this is a step that angered Putin very much. He objected to it, and he expressed his views on the matter and threatened Ukraine repeatedly about its orientation of its foreign policy. And the final implication of the Revolution of Dignity is that Russia declared the impeachment of Yanukovych an illegal coup. And it continues to the day to claim that Yanukovych was the last legitimate president of Ukraine that is currently in exile. And even in the initial round of negotiations that took place early this month in March, Putin demanded for the replacement of Zelensky's Nazi regime, or at the very least keeping him a pro forma president, but for the last legitimate president who happens to be a pro-Russian candidate, back from exile and to assume his legitimate power in Ukraine. Now, Yanukovych was not named explicitly, although he has featured in the news, but as there are several other potential candidates in Ukraine as well, who are vetted by Kremlin and that could perform the role of the new legitimate government in Ukraine, in the post-Nazi, denazified Ukraine. I hope I managed to not go over my 5 minutes. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panels.
You did, Olga. Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Zsuzsa Csergo, please.
Can you please bring up the
Yes.
graph? Excellent, thank you. Should I?
You can, but if you just stop.
Okay, can you hear me well? Okay. So I will follow up on Olga's presentation by focusing on how the war impacts the rest of the region. And I will focus primarily on how it impacts democracy, prospects for democracy. Of course, we also have to recognize that there are significant immediate effects. The humanitarian crisis affects the entire region. There are over 4 million refugees currently, very, very high number from Ukraine, in the neighboring countries mostly, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and no, primarily. There are also, of course, concerns about escalation, major concerns about escalation, concerns about the regional effects of any use of weapons of mass destruction. The memory of Chernobyl is on people's minds in the region. And so these are acute, immediate, significant effects. I do want to talk about the longer term effects as well. And so even just thinking about the 4 million plus refugees, there is great empathy right now in these societies in Poland and Romania, Hungary, all over, across the board for these refugees. However, having said that, from the perspective of the future of democracy, we have to remember that this is a region where interethnic solidarity is always fragile. And it's also a region that in which democracy has been declining in the last 10 years. We also have to remember that these are societies that have no experience with immigrant integration. This is something that I emphasized in my class earlier, that whereas Western European societies like Germany and Austria and the others have had experience with immigrant integration after World War II, there was not much reason for people to flee to communist countries. So these people were trying to escape from the communist countries. These were not immigrant recipient societies. People have little experience with it. We also know from other regions, other experiences, for example, large numbers of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, in Turkey, that after a while, it becomes a source of tension. So it's something to keep in mind, that it's likely to become a medium term problem, especially as economies are affected by the war. And it's very easy. We know this from history, and we know this from comparative contemporary cases as well, that unfortunately, non-natives are very frequently scapegoated when the economy goes down, and there's especially populist politicians can use it, or in their nationalist populist rhetoric, to say that the non-native populations are taking away resources and so on. So there's this term in political science, especially security studies, called ontological security, when there is a particular conception of nationhood and is presented as being threatened. And so we have to keep that in mind. I'd like to point that out. And then there is the major long-term impact on democracy. The reason why I'm showing you this map is that it's a map from Freedom House's index. They have a specific index also for this region, nations in transit. Of course, all of these comparative indices are oversimplified, but it does give us something about how these countries have evolved. So this is a map of democracy in this region in 2020. It was published in 2000.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you mind just taking it off full screen? Just because on virtual, we're not able to see your map centered.
Okay. So on virtual, you cannot see the map. And can we share?
That's much better for us, if that's
Yes.
okay with you.
So the colors on the map, I'm going to go on because I don't want to take up too much time. So the colors.
Is it okay now, Michael?
Can you see it?
Yes, yes, that looks great. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
So the colors on the map show that the deep purple is, those are the countries that are actually consolidated authoritarian regimes. So Russia, Belarus, I'm not going to have time to go into detail about this, but what I'd like to say is that the reason why the map looks like this, that the countries around Russia, only the 3 Baltic states are dark green, meaning that they are consolidated democracies, is that those were able to get away in time at the beginning of the 1990s and to join NATO and join the European Union. And so they had been part of not just the Soviet bloc, but of the Soviet Union proper. And they managed to become independent, and not just become independent formally like Belarus, for example, that remained a puppet state of Moscow, but independent and also integrated into the Western structures, security and economic structures. And so they are consolidated democracies. I'll go back to why this war is going to likely affect that, by the way. But if you look at Ukraine and Moldova, those other 2 post-Soviet countries that became independent, they are orangely coded, which means that they are in fact hybrid regimes, which is it's a category that means that it's not really in the democracy sphere anymore, or yet. So they were stuck there. And the reason they were stuck there was that Russia made sure that they cannot be categorized as democracies by undermining, using military intervention in Moldova since the 1990s, supporting resources secessionists in Transnistria who have created a so-called de facto state, the Transnistrian state. There's no way the European Union or NATO can take in a country that has a secessionist region. The European Union has the so-called Copenhagen Treaty, 9 conditions, criteria adopted in 1993. And a basic requirement there, of course, is that you have to have sovereignty, statehood that's recognized and legitimate. And you also have to have at least semi-consolidated democracy and good democracy. So if Russia makes sure that these countries have no legitimate sovereignty, then there's no way they can become part of NATO or the European Union, right? And so there you have Ukraine and Moldova. the Putin government has been using soft power, non-interventionist, non-military interventionist measures to weaken democracy also in other parts of the region, supporting non-democratic, authoritarian leaning governments such as Viktor Orban's government in Hungary, also supporting governments like that and using orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy in the Balkans. And so countries like Serbia, if you look at the map, you see that all of those countries of the former Yugoslavia are hybrid regimes, and the only two that are in the democracy sphere are the following two. Slovenia, that was able to secede first non-violently from Yugoslavia and became part of the European Union immediately, and Croatia later, because it has not been affected by the orthodoxy myth of kinship that Putin's government has been using. So this is not a great picture in 2020, and keep in mind that the likelihood is that it's going to become even more fragile. And on that unhappy note, I'm going to end and give it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zsuzsa. And our next speaker is Thomas Hughes. Thomas, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's see if I can get through this in the 5 minutes. I'm going to be talking about the military component to what's been going on over the past month or so, and I'm going to take a fairly chronological look at this. That means we're going to be talking about the what rather than the why. If anyone's got questions about the why, if we've got time at the end, I'm more than happy to share that. So, awful lot has happened in the past month, and so I think it is worth going back to the very first invasion, the start of the invasion. And we talk about the war in Ukraine, and it's something of a misnomer to the extent that there are multiple axes of advance from the Russian military. So there are different conflicts happening in different places. Essentially, there were four to start with. The first from the north came down from Belarus, trying to get to Kyiv. Second up from Crimea, which had been annexed in 2014. The third pushing down towards the Donbass through Kharkiv, which you can see kind of in the middle there, and then the final one through the Donbass region, trying to consolidate the gains that they had already made in that region from 2014. As the first speaker said, I think they made a catastrophic error in the sense they anticipated a very short war. They anticipated, it seems, that the Ukrainian military would capitulate fairly quickly, that that Kyiv would fall, that Zelensky would no longer be in government within about 72 hours. That obviously did not occur. What we saw, even though that was not the case, just a week into the invasion, Russia had actually made some fairly significant advances. Now, we have to be very careful with maps. As a point of warning for these maps, usually what happens is that the most forward troops are marked on a map, and then you get the dot to dot that happens, and everything behind it is colored in. So just as a basic example of that, we'll come back to this in a second, this is rather later, but is perhaps a better example of a map of control. So Russia, as part of that rapid advance, did not spend a great deal of time consolidating the gains that they made. It was a very quick approach to try and finish the war fast. Unfortunately, from the Russian perspective, the Ukrainian resistance was very strong, bolstered by some serious weaponry that was provided by NATO members, and that really exploited some huge strategic flaws and logistical problems that the Russian military was undergoing. So when we get about a week later from there, we can see that actually things haven't changed very much at all. The advance from the northeast towards Kyiv had been pretty significant, but other than that, essentially there was a stop. There was an attack that was going eastwards from Crimea to try and again link up with Donbass, and was partly stopped with Mariupol, which has now unfortunately been encircled, but is still holding out, though probably not for many more days. Again, this is 10 days later. You can see that we are seeing not a great deal of change. One thing that it is important to note here, however, is that Russia changed their approach. They acknowledged, I think, that they weren't going to win this war quickly, and we started to see the more large-scale attacks on cities and more indiscriminate attacks on cities. They were particularly those that they had bypassed originally in those lines of advance. So this is roughly where we are today, according to the British Ministry of Defence, but I think probably a slightly better map is this one, which gives you a more of an understanding of what's going on here. Remarkably, and I am really genuinely surprised by this, Ukraine has started to retake some ground that it had lost in the earlier phases of the war. They're not huge, although the yellow splotches on the map look like they are. And Russia has acknowledged that it is not going to be able to take Kyiv. It's not even going to be able to encircle Kyiv. So it's removing some of its troops from around there. Don't get overboard on this. They talked about withdrawing from Kyiv. They are going to keep a lot of troops there to try and keep the Ukrainian military tied down in that region. But they are going to be redistributed, really, probably towards the eastern area of the conflict, potentially in the south as well. But the likelihood is they're going to be looking at the Donbass. One other little thing to note on here that we should probably watch out for from the Russian perspective in the not too distant future is a push northwards up the Dnieper River towards Dnipro, because an awful lot of Ukrainian troops are currently in the east. And if they can make that surge northwards and cut off those troops, Ukrainian troops in the east, that is not going to be very pleasant for the Ukrainian military. One final point that I will make, because we talk a lot about the fighting, but this has been a remarkable aspect to the conflict. We haven't really seen this before. In fact, there's two elements to this conflict, really. The first is two very high technology adversaries fighting, and the second is the information component of this. And information has been such a huge part, not just in shaping the space that we've, in the way that we've seen information in the past, but has really been a way for Ukraine to demonstrate who they are and bolster their support and make it very difficult for NATO leaders not to provide the military support that's being asked for. And of course, the Ukrainian tractor pulling away Russian military equipment is probably the best example of that. So I hope I haven't gone for too long. I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Thomas, thank you very much. And our last speaker is David Pedlar.
Great. So hi, everybody. My name is David Pedlar, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to come together and talk about this material. First of all, when I first started my work in Ukraine about 6 years ago, working on the development of veterans programs for the country after the war in Donbass, I was it became quite apparent to me that really none of my colleagues knew almost anything about Ukraine. They didn't know about Donbass or about the annexation of Crimea. So I think events like this are really important because right now we have to get educated more and more about Ukraine. So thank you for doing this, and I'm pleased to participate. The first thing I wanted to just draw out is that, and if you wanted to use trauma language, we would really clearly define this as a mass trauma or mass violence event. So it's really important that we think about that and what it means. So at this point, I think most of us here are witness to the 36 days of sudden damage and distress that has touched the lives of millions, resulting in death, physical and mental health injury, destruction of infrastructure, closure of basic institutions, and the quick separation of social connections and families. Another thing we talk about is exposure. So what are people being exposed to that can lead to trauma responses? I happen to know many people in Ukraine because of the work I've done there. So I'm going to talk about exposure, but I'll just sort of do it quickly through the things I've been seeing. So today, many of the people I know are among the astonishing 11 million or 1/4 of native Ukrainians who are now displaced. That's 4 million as refugees. That means they've crossed borders, many to nearby nations, and the 7 million or so that are internally displaced. Many to the west of Ukraine in places like Lviv, but also smaller communities around Lviv and further south. Many of my colleagues and friends fled in their car or in overcrowded trains with only hours of preparation. Others stayed in Kiev seeking shelter from aerial bombardment. I know people who have lived in the Kiev metro now for over a month with children and pets. Many are also alone in dark basements in their apartments with air raid sirens going off. Others are men and women who joined civilian territorial defense uniforms. They picked up weapons with only a day of training. And others have a strong military experience, and they're fighting in close proximity with the invaders. We would define this as very intense combat experience that would have, long-term implications, high intensity. So what are the mental and public health impacts of this kind of mass trauma event? Well, the immediate effects that we expect in the first phase of a crisis will always depend on the individual, but include normal stress reactions like exhaustion, confusion, numbness, disassociation, anxiety, sadness, anger, disassociation, and more. But normally you don't get PTSD just by being exposed to trauma or related mental health conditions. PTSD rarely is a diagnosis that comes by itself. It usually has comorbidities that come along with it. So I guess one thing to remember is that when we're exposed to war or trauma, many don't go on to develop PTSD. People are very resilient. Many will recover, but there will be major and in some cases long life impacts from this mass trauma experience. The extent of long-term impact and likelihood of PTSD will be determined by the severity and scope of the war, the individual experiences people have, the duration of the war, but also how we can intervene in the experiences they're having now as IDPs and as refugees. And I'll say more about that in a minute. I also want to say something about re-experiencing, which is to say that part of exposure is re-exposure and re-exposure to traumatic events. And so most people here probably know that this is a new stage of an ongoing war that has been raging and sometimes simmering since 2014. But since 2014, 14,000 soldiers have died. And in the early phases, 1.5 million Ukrainians were internally displaced. So people I know are now being re-exposed, but also re-displaced. They lived in Crimea and left, and they lived in Donbass and left. And that was really a mass displacement that many people outside of Ukraine are not familiar with. We actually don't have good health studies inside Ukraine around mental health. We don't have population-based health studies. So I can't quantify the impacts, but the impacts would be significant. Another factor in play here is that we know about is that human intentional acts of war versus natural disasters are known to cause more psychological distress. So this would sort of really clearly fall into that. Most of us think that this war is senseless and unnecessary. And this is the kind of war that gets deeply etched into the collective consciousness of a people. So I'm expecting that this is what we're going to see happen here. And so this won't be something that will be short term. It will be generations long is where we're heading with this right now. So finally, what about interventions? Well, we do know a lot about disaster intervention based on experiences over the past 50 years. This is called things like disaster mental health, crisis intervention, disaster psychiatry. These are usually guidelines. And we look at population level when we're looking at mass trauma. And they're usually population and individual interventions. They're defined by stages of a crisis with different kinds of interventions along the way. At this stage, though, in the earlier stage of a traumatic or mass trauma, mental health first aid is a well-known approach used by many humanitarian and aid organizations, and it operates on 5 principles, focusing on promoting safety, calming, connectedness, the return of self-efficacy and collective efficacy, that you have control over your life, as well as the importance of hope. But early on, and right now in many places, it's about safety, food, shelter, and connectedness. and later moving towards renormalization of life. So, so really now a key factor in all this is safety and basic needs. But there's a spectrum of conditions facing Ukrainians right now. So some are actually under siege and trapped without food, water, electricity, or medical care. There are 7 million internally displaced people who left their homes very quickly. Many in Western Ukraine, they're safer than the people that are under siege, but they're facing air raid sirens, new bombardment, but they also have limited or no access to the full range of refugee supports that you might find in Poland and some of the other nations. And many of these are temporary. They're facing every day trying to decide whether they're going to need to relocate it or what they're going to do next. I really want to underline the importance of family and friends and connectedness going through these experiences. That's a great source of anxiety, but it's also one of the most important sources of support. So forming new social networks and encouraging the formation of social networks is really, really important. And knowing the well-being and whereabouts of family members is also of great importance. So ending the story is that we don't know the end of the story. We could still be early on this. We're keeping a close eye on what happens on a day-by-day basis. A key question for us, though, is the roles that we can play in responding to this humanitarian tragedy. But I think that we have to think about the role of trauma-informed care in a lot of the work we do in interventions. So, so hopefully I've brought that to our consciousness today. And I'll be continuing to stay engaged in this in this subject area. It's very close to me now because of the work I've done there over the last 6 years. So thanks.
Thank you very much for all experts who gave us this rounded overview of what is going on, including the background and so on. So we have 2 minutes remaining, so I guess we have time for 2 questions. I'm just checking the chat to see if there are any questions in the chat. No. And so the audience, please.
Olga has her hand raised virtually.
Olga, please.
Sorry, I didn't type my question in. I had a general question for perhaps the first 3 panelists, the historians, who talked about historical narratives and memory, collective memory. Victory Day is approaching fast. That is the Russian Victory Day over in the Second World War, and especially Rebecca Manley touched on that and how the images are so similar, strikingly similar in some respects. And I just wonder if you think Putin has any resources to align the events, but also distance himself from the obvious opposites in the events, where Russia is the invader and not being invaded, where Russia is the one doing the bombing of civilian population, inflicting the, those tragic things on the civilian population, and not being on the defensive side. Whether you think how they will approach this, the formation of a new memory around this event against the, celebration of Victory Day on May 9th. Thank you.
This is an excellent question, and I think clearly over the last several celebrations of Victory Day have already, it's been very contentious on an international stage in Russia. I think that Putin, his presentation, clearly he does not acknowledge that this is a war. They don't acknowledge that they are not, it is not proceeding as they expected and anticipated and hoped. And he frames this, he has very deliberately framed this within the context of Soviet and a Russian defense of, values against fascism. So I think what we're likely to see actually quite substantial activities on May 9th. And there will be no acknowledgement of that tension that you elucidated. Rather, we'll see a retrenchment of this is the victory of, against fascism, and we're waging that war still.
I thought the original plan was to do it on March 18, the anniversary of Crimea. One last question, Jonah, please.
So, okay, I'll ask this question then to Thomas Hughes. Well, the news you shared of Ukraine's pushback, Ukrainian pushback is happy news. There have been a lot of assertions about Russia winning the war, Ukraine winning the war, etc. I presume it's not going to be just a flat out win on one side or the other. The principal factors in these is like how determined Ukraine is, how much military aid they've received, Russian supply lines failing, timing of the war being too long. They'd not planned for economic fallout. So in your expert opinion, what is the likely outcome of the war and why is that the likely outcome? Like, is it more likely that China becomes more involved than just the information war, or that NATO actually involves itself in closing the airspace? Anything in that jurisdiction?
Thomas, maybe.
Yeah, great question. Frankly, if I had the answer to that, I'm not sure I would be sitting here. I'd be earning an awful lot of money from government intelligence services somewhere. It's a hugely challenging question. What I would say, thinking about how this conflict might come to a conclusion, I think somewhat surprisingly, it appears that Ukraine would be able to hold out, particularly in the west of the country, almost indefinitely if the military support continues to come through from NATO. Again, we are only a month and a little bit into this conflict. Wars can go on for an awful long time. This one is going to continue to rumble. I don't think we'll see any NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine formally or in public. We'll certainly not see NATO trying to close any airspace if that would bring them into contact with Russian forces. Similarly, I think China's hedging their bets at the moment. China's waiting to see how the conflict develops. The last thing that they want is to end up having their troops involved in this conflict as well. So I think Chinese engagement with Russia will be very interesting to watch. It will only, I would imagine, be on the economic side. And they are going to continue to watch the extent of, as Dr. Csergo pointed out, the extent to which Western countries remain coherent in their approach to Russia over the next 5 to 10 years. I hope that they do. I hope that pressure continues to be put on Russia, but it's not guaranteed at this stage.
Okay, thank you very much. Zsuzsa, do you want to conclude?
I would just conclude by thanking everyone for volunteering your time and expertise, and especially for our external scholars, panelists, Dr. Olga Andriewsky from Trent University and Dr. Koznarsky from the University of Toronto, and also our Queen's experts, our historians, Professor Manley, Rebecca Manley, and Professor, I wish Vassili Schedrin could have also had, I'm sure that he has a lot to share that would be helpful for us to understand the context of this. And doctors, Olga Talal and Thomas Hughes, excuse me, Queens, and what else should I say? My wonderful students were inspiring us to want to teach and try to understand also for you, so that we can tell you something that might be helpful for you to make sense of this. And one thing that I think it was a good way to close by Thomas, actually Olga's question too, is like, is there a chance that the Putin story is going to change? And the answer is, it doesn't look like it. And for Thomas Hughes to end by saying that this is very likely to continue to become a protracted conflict. Professor David Pedlar gave us a lot of food for thought. This is not usually brought in to the picture, the public health and social trauma, right? Experiences that are going to be long-term. And so all of this together, I just keep thinking that there's such a deep uncertainty around this whole conflict, war, this terrible aggression, and we have to stay hopeful. So stay hopeful, stay safe, and I'm sure you have other questions too that we can pick up hopefully next week. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Some of your colleagues. Oh, sure. If that's okay.
Vassili, you might want to stop recording now.
Yeah.